Good day. This is going to be yet another video discussing the world crisis that centers on Ukraine. Again, I have to apologize to some extent for this overwhelming focus on Ukraine, but it is, as I've discussed many times, the central pivotal crisis around which all of the others are arranging themselves. Even the crisis between the United States and China over Taiwan is to some extent now becoming affected or at least influenced by the events in Ukraine and the larger crisis between Russia and the West over Ukraine. So I'm going to start, as I traditionally do, with a roundup of military information. Now, the big story in eastern Ukraine, as by the way even the British Ministry of Defence seems to somewhat grudgingly concede, is the steady, and in fact not just steady, but now increasingly rapid Russian gains in the northern Donbass area, where the Russians are tightening their grip around the Ukrainian forces in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and where we now get steady news about more villages and more settlements falling under Russian control as the trap around the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk slams shut. Now, I will again make the same observation that I have made many times. There was always the option, going back weeks, to withdraw the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk to more defensible lines. This was always a salient, or rather this has been a salient for a long, long time. It's never made at least much military sense that I can see for Ukraine to hold on to these two undefendable or indefensible towns, and that keeping large concentrations of Ukrainian troops in these two towns, reports suggest that there may be around 8,000 men there, was ultimately misconceived. Well, I had speculated, there were suggestions that after the fall of Popasnaya, the Ukrainians would pull most of these troops out of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, or there were suggestions that the Ukrainian troops from Lysychansk would pull back, leaving presumably the troops in Severodonetsk to their fate, or that the troops in Severodonetsk would withdraw from Severodonetsk to Lysychansk, which is supposedly more defendable because it is on higher ground. Well, none of that has happened. The Ukrainians continue to pursue this policy of holding on to ground wherever they can, engaging in these stand and fight orders, even as this causes them very heavy accumulating losses. Now, much has been said and written in the Western media about the Ukrainian offensive in northeast of Kharkiv. I would say that, again, somewhat reading between the lines, even once more the British Ministry of Defence, which never misses an opportunity to talk up Ukrainian victories, as it describes them, or Russian defeats, even the Ministry of Defence, the British Ministry of Defence, that you have to pass and read its statements very carefully, appears to concede that what has happened northeast of Kharkiv is less a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, more an organised pullback of Russian forces from an area which is of lesser interest to the Russians at this particular time. Now, of course, that's not all the British have said about this particular withdrawal. They've tried to explain it as showing that the Russians lack the ability to capture large cities. Well, I'm not sure how that accords with the capture of Mariupol or Kherson or other places, but, let's let that by. But the important point is that the Russians did withdraw from northeastern Kharkiv. They weren't exactly driven back by some great Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, this is interesting and important because it does show again the contrast The Russians are prepared to undertake withdrawals when they see it as being in their tactical interest to do so. They do not engage in stand and fight orders. The Ukrainians do. And I would suggest that this shows the difference between a military, which is led by professionals, which is, of course, the Russian military, which has flexibility in making these kind of decisions, and a military led by amateurs, which is the Ukrainian military, which is driven overwhelmingly and disproportionately by considerations of politics and face, and which lacks, therefore, the self-confidence to make withdrawals when those are considered necessary. Now, lest anybody accuse me of suggesting that this is all turning into an easy victory for the Russians in northern Donbass, I'm going to say straight away that, on the contrary, the fighting in this area remains extremely intense. Ukrainian troops continue to fight and fight back very bravely when they can, and on several occasions they have achieved important tactical successes. And one of these tactical successes has been much talked about in the media over the last few days. The Russians tried at some place connected to the ETHEREUM front. It's not entirely clear to me where this happened, but they do seem to have tried to force a crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River. Now, I am not, as I said, a person with much grasp of military affairs. I'm also a person who has difficulty reading maps because of eyesight problems. So I have great difficulty. In fact, I'm not going to even try to locate where this particular incident took place. Suffice to say that it does seem to be related to the overall battle that's been waged to entrap these Ukrainian troops in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation. And the Severodonetsk River seems to be a part of the Seversky Donetsk River, seems to be a river. From the photos, the pictures I've seen, it's not particularly broad, but it is an important river obstacle which is posing problems for both the Russians and the Ukrainians, interestingly enough, in this particular part of the front. There are places where the Ukrainians have tried to force river crossings and have been driven back with heavy losses by the Russians. And we now have rather dramatic pictures of an attempted river crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River by the Russians, which got caught in heavy Ukrainian artillery fire and which clearly ended in a complete failure. And we see lots of dramatic pictures of destroyed Russian tanks and armored vehicles and of a destroyed pontoon bridge across the Seversky Donetsk River. Now, a number of things need to be said. Firstly, this is proof that the Ukrainians can hit the Russians hard in various places in the northern Donbass, and in this particular case, they succeeded in doing so. Secondly, there is no dispute at all that this was a Russian defeat. Thirdly, it is a defeat that must be understood in the overall context of the Russian strategic offensive, which is taking place around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and which is tightening the trap around the Ukrainian troops who have found themselves there. And lastly, and I have to say this, and I'm basing this now not on any Russian reports, but interestingly enough on a report by the BBC of all places, that some of these photographs of this particular crossing may not show quite what some commentators say. There's been suggestions that an entire Russian battalion was wiped out during this crossing. The BBC interviewed A British military specialist who looked at these pictures has suggested that many of these vehicles that appear in these photographs, which look like they were knocked out in the shelling, were probably destroyed by the Russians themselves when they pulled back, so that these vehicles would not fall into Ukrainian hands. And he's cast doubt on the suggestion that an entire battalion has been wiped out. He's put the numbers of Russian troops killed at something like 180, which would still be, by the way, a very significant number who might have been killed in this particular river crossing. I've seen other Russian reports, by the way, none from the Russian Ministry of Defense, but I've seen other Russian reports that put it as fewer, as about 50. I can't confirm this one way or the other. But regardless, this is clearly a setback, worse than a setback, Russians getting a bloody nose in a particular place. But I would also say something which I've learned a great deal about from the rather rushed reading of military history that I've been engaging in over the last few weeks, which is that virtually everybody who has any knowledge of military operations agrees and accepts that contested river crossings are some of the most dangerous operations that troops can carry out, and that when they fail, they can fail catastrophically, resulting in extremely heavy losses. So this is probably a case of that, and it's not surprising. And the Russian commentaries that I have seen, whilst acknowledging this defeat, seem to be confident that the town in this particular area, the settlement that was the target of this Russian offensive, would in fact be this Russian offensive in which this river crossing was a part, and which is, as I said, part of the overall Severodonetsk-Lysychansk battle, that this place would eventually be recaptured by the Russians, or captured by the Russians, over the course of the next few days. So this is what seems to have happened. But as I said, it is an instructive and important lesson that this is not, as I said, a battle in which one side always wins and or one side always loses. I hope I've never given that impression. On the contrary, this is a battle which the Russians unequivocally lost. Anyway, having said that, it doesn't change the overall outcome, which is that we are looking at the catastrophic collapse of Ukrainian resistance in the northern Donbass, in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation, a collapse which was avoidable, or at least where it would have been avoidable that the Ukrainians would lose the large numbers of men that they are in the process of losing. And it seems that a Ukrainian counteroffensive, which was planned on the flank of the Russian forces in ETHEREUM, has had to be called off, as troops who had been allocated to this counteroffensive, which by the way would also have involved a river crossing, have had to be redeployed in haste to try to plug the gaps in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation. Anyway, the fact that the Ukrainians are trying to plug the gaps, that they're apparently throwing in increasingly large numbers of reservists into these battles, people who do not have training or full training and are not up to taking on the professional troops who staff the Russian military. Well, to my mind, that's another case of Ukraine reinforcing failure. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the battle in northern Donbass. Elsewhere, Russian advances are more incremental, but there are some reports that the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic has achieved some kind of breakthrough against some part of the fortified line that the Ukrainians constructed opposite Donetsk. I am completely unable to confirm this, and information to this effect is sparse. But if this has indeed happened, then it seems to me, be a further blow to the Ukrainian positions in the entire Donbass. And it would suggest to me also, by the way, that the Ukrainians are having to divert resources from supporting or reinforcing this particular line facing Donetsk, because of their need to try to plug the gaps in the northern Donbass, in the area around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Anyway, that's my understanding of the overall situation. Meanwhile, the Russians have again been active. They've been carrying out all kinds of missile strikes all across Ukraine. A few days ago, they launched hypersonic missile strikes on what they claim were important strategic locations in Odessa, and they've launched further attacks on Ukraine's major remaining refinery, the Kremenchuk refinery, aggravating Ukraine's fuel crisis, ongoing fuel crisis. But that's, as I said, an overall summary of the war. I would also say that the Russians have now shown, or there's been photos now shown, of the Donbass militia in possession of one of the M777 howitzers, which have been supplied by the United States and one or two of the other Western states, and which have been much talked about, but which some commentators like Scott Ritter have suggested are not the military game changer that many people said they were. I can't confirm the validity of this photograph. If it is one of these howitzers, it's interesting that the Donetsk militia has been able to capture it. It would suggest that some of these howitzers are getting through to the front lines, but it doesn't seem as if they're changing the outcomes of the battle. Anyway, other news is perhaps more important, and we are getting further indications that there are serious problems now with the entire package of action that the European Union has been trying to take on the energy front. Firstly, there are reports this morning in the Daily Telegraph, not so far denied, as far as I can see, that the European Commission has given up hope of trying to persuade the Hungarians to relent their opposition to the proposed oil embargo, and that they're now considering dropping the oil sanctions against Russia from the sixth energy package. This has, however, apparently infuriated the hardliners, which essentially means Poland, though I'm guessing that on this issue it might also include France, and that these countries in turn are threatening to sanction the entire sixth sanctions package if it does not include oil sanctions. If this story is true, and the Daily Telegraph claims it comes from diplomatic sources close to the Commission, then it suggests that this whole sixth sanctions package was completely misconceived, that the EU didn't plan or think this through properly, and that there are now real problems with it, and we will see how this works out. I will say that the Hungarians always said that energy sanctions were for them a red line, but I have to also say that I underestimated the extent to which the Hungarians would stick by that red line. And I can only assume that the Hungarians have done so in part because they've had quiet support from certain other EU member states, probably mainly in Central Europe, so that they've probably been given assurances that if the worst steps by the EU Commission to try to deprive Hungary of its voting rights on the EU Council, that Central and East European states would oppose it and in effect block it. And at the same time, we learned that France and various other Central European states are now and also Italy, now want to slow down moves towards Ukraine's EU accession. And President Erdogan of Turkey has, for his part, made it clear that he opposes Sweden's and Finland's accession to NATO. So all sorts of problems are starting to work up to the surface. Now, I don't know, I still am not sure how significant these obstacles are. In the case of President Erdogan, it's not impossible that this is just a bidding war, and that he says that for the moment that he's going to stop Finland and Sweden joining NATO in return for something, F-35 fighter jets, more money, who knows what, from the West. And what he's really basically holding out is a high price. That wouldn't be uncharacteristic of the man. But anyway, he's speaking of Finland and Sweden being countries that support terrorism, that have shown sympathy for the Kurds, and that he really doesn't think that their membership of NATO is at all appropriate. Well, we'll see what happens. And as for the stops, the block on Ukraine's membership of the EU, I think that is much more likely. I think that the objections to Ukraine joining the EU, especially while there is a war going on on Ukrainian territory, I think those are going to be much stronger. The Russians, by the way, have now made it clear that they will strongly oppose any move by Ukraine to join the EU. And this is a hardening of the Russian position, consequent upon the decision by Ukraine to withdraw the concessions it made during the talks in Istanbul in March. Anyway, the Russians have made it clear that they are opposed to Ukraine joining the EU. And as I said, there does seem to be within the EU increasing opposition to Ukraine joining the EU. So as things stand today, though I still don't quite believe it, it is possible that we won't get an oil embargo on Russia, that Turkey will block Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO, and that other EU states, France, Italy, some of the others, will also move to block Ukraine joining the EU. If any one of these three things happen, and of course if all of them do, then, to be very clear, this will all be a bad defeat for the EU Commission, and above all for its president, Ursula von der Leyen. Anyway, we will see what happens. I would stress, don't count your chickens on this one. Don't assume that anything is going to happen. I think the momentum for oil sanctions still remains extremely strong. I think that some countries still want to see the Ukraine in NATO, in the EU, regardless of all other considerations. And the same applies about Finland's and Sweden's membership of NATO. On the latter point, if Turkey and perhaps some other NATO countries, possibly Hungary again, do block Finland's and Sweden's membership of NATO, then that will be a heavy political blow to the governments of Finland and Sweden. And I do wonder whether either of those two governments would survive. But, that's not a scenario which we are at the moment. I will discuss it further if and when it happens. But perhaps there's been yet another development which I still find extremely interesting, and that is that the German government, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, again called Vladimir Putin today. And this conversation, we have a readout of it on the Kremlin website. It isn't very informative. It says that Putin complained about the way in which the Ukrainians keep civilians hostage. He discussed again the situation in Mariupol, in the Azovstal factory. He also apparently informed Scholz about the complete deadlock into which negotiations between Russia and Ukraine have fallen into. Well, Scholz can't have been expecting, or wouldn't have been expecting, or so it seems to me, any real movement from Putin on all of this. So that does beg the question of why Scholz called Putin at this time. And I'm going to make my own guess, which is that the Germans are now becoming increasingly nervous about the situation over gas. Ukraine, as we know, has closed access to one of the pipelines, one of the transmission pipes which goes through Lugansk region. The Ukrainians have turned it off, reducing the total amount of energy flow that flows to Europe. Now, the Germans have pointed out that they get all their gas from Nord Stream 1. So this interruption of gas doesn't supposedly affect them. However, in reality, it does, because the Germans are at the moment obliged, or have obliged themselves, to make up for less gas received by other EU member states from their own reserves. And that is making it more difficult for the Germans to replace, to build up the gas that they keep in their own underground reserves. So, of course, this interruption of gas via Ukraine, and also the Russians have now confirmed that they're stopping supplies of gas through the Yamal pipeline intended for Poland. That clearly is creating problems. That would ultimately create problems for Germany. The Germans, by the way, might also have been rattled by reports that the Russians are in the process of stopping gas supplies to Finland. Now, Finland has refused to sign up to the gas for ruble scheme, but they're not yet at the position, the Finns aren't yet at the position where they need to buy more gas from the Russians. The gas that Finland is receiving apparently is gas that Finland has already paid for, but there was some talk that the Russians had already switched the gas off. And it may be that Scholz was rather alarmed about that, and that he wanted to speak to Putin about this. But anyway, it seems that particular story, the Russians have denied it, and it appears to be fake news. There's so far no interruption of gas from Russia to Finland. But there is something else which has happened, which must be causing Scholz and the Germans a great deal of alarm. Because some weeks ago, the German government basically seized a whole set of assets that belonged to Gazprom in Germany. German registered companies, but owned by Gazprom, and various other companies and assets owned by Gazprom, which were then taken over by German managers so that Germany could continue to operate these entities, which are essential to fill up the energy reserves. Well, the Russians have now slapped sanctions on all of these entities, and that could potentially interfere with supplies of gas from Russia to Germany. So it's perhaps not impossible, in fact it's highly likely, that all of these accumulated worries about the gas situation might have caused Scholz anxiously to pick up the telephone to Putin, the Russians have made it clear that it was Scholz who initiated the call to try to see some sort of way out. The Kremlin readout makes no reference to gas issues at all, which may be a sign that it was not about gas, but it could also be a sign that this aspect of the discussion was so sensitive that the Russians, the Kremlin, took a decision not to publish any information about it. Anyway, one gets the overall sense, and this is all very, very tentative, that, as I said, the sanctions drive is now running into problems, and that some EU countries are starting to worry about where all this is going and are starting to try to find some kind of way to get off this sanctions escalator that they've trapped themselves into. Perhaps that was the cause of Scholz's call to Putin. Another possibility, of course, is that the Europeans, who are undoubtedly familiar with the real course of events on the military fronts, are becoming increasingly alarmed that Ukraine isn't winning the war after all, and that with the pending collapse of Ukrainian resistance in the northern Donbass, the Ukrainian position, the position of the best part of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine, is now coming under increasing crisis. So maybe Scholz was worrying about that. After all, it would be a political disaster for the EU if Ukraine was seen to lose and lose comprehensively. And that may have been another reason why Scholz called Putin. Maybe he was again trying to persuade Putin to sit down and speak to Zelensky in a one-to-one meeting, something which the Russians have continued, by the way, to reject. The Russians continue to insist that there has to be a comprehensive treaty drawn up and provisionally agreed before such a Zelensky-Putin meeting ever happens. So it could be that Scholz again is trying to find some way to get the negotiations going, to try to get himself out of the trap into which his weakness has led Germany and Europe. Well, I don't know, but certainly things do seem to be afoot. Things do seem to be happening, both on the military front, following the Russian breakthrough in Popasnaya, and they seem to be happening on the sanctions front, with all kinds of problems starting to build up. And it's interesting again that Scholz has now broken the silence that all other European leaders have pursued in discussions with Putin, apart from President Macron of France, and has finally picked up the telephone and called Putin and had some sort of discussion. I don't think this has any consequence at the moment. I think the Russians are so angry that I think they're going to press ahead with their military campaign in Ukraine, but it's likely that the Russians will see it as signs of increasing nerves on the European side. Meanwhile, I will finish off this video by saying that Putin has had another meeting in a long series of meetings on economic issues with his top economic advisors. Now, this is an interesting fact because can I just say that it's such a contrast to what is happening in the West. I've lost track of how many of these meetings Putin has had, but he has regular meetings in which he brings together all his top people, those people who deal with the economy, the Prime Minister, Mishustin, the Finance Minister, Siluanov, the Central Bank Chair, Nabulina, his Chief Economics Advisor, Belousov, his Industry Minister, Manturov. They all come together, they all have discussions, They talk about what they're going to do to respond to the sanctions, to stabilize the economic situation in Russia. And they all have these meetings, and they happen, and one gets the impression that all kinds of decisions are made, all sorts of plans are worked out, all sorts of steps are taken to deal with the various problems in the Russian economy. Now, I follow the news in various countries. I don't see anything analogous happening in the United States or in Britain or in any of the major big EU states. And of course, the EU Commission seems to be spending far more time trying to work out what more sanctions it can impose on Russia, even at the cost of the EU economy, than at planning upon how to deal with the immediate economic crisis that is engulfing Europe. As I said, the Russians have been taking a different approach. And this was, by some distance, the most upbeat of the meetings that Putin has held, at least judging by his comments. He spoke about the fact that the ruble continues to strengthen. He spoke about the fact that the rate of inflation in Russia has now fallen to 0.1% or a week. Now that is roughly in line with standard inflation in Russia at this point in the year. So it would suggest that the steps taken by the central bank, the steps taken by the various industry ministries to work out either import substitution programs or to source goods and raw materials that Russia can't import from Europe, from other countries, that all of these are starting to bear fruit. And he also reported another piece of unequivocally good news from a Russian point of view, which is that it seems the preliminary indications are we're still at a relatively early point in the agricultural year, but the early indications are that Russia is going to have a bumper harvest, a record harvest this year, which will provide an abundance of food to release on the Russian market and indeed to supply Russian customers overseas, which will of course provide Russia with another source of foreign currency revenue, and which will also depress inflation, because it should mean that food prices will remain under control within Russia itself. So Putin seems to be comparatively upbeat about the overall state of the economy. Now, I want to make again a further point. There will be a GDP contraction in Russia. There will be an industrial slowdown in Russia until import substitution programs have been fully worked out. But for the moment, the Russians seem confident that they have the situation under control. Even as things elsewhere in the world become bleaker, the Russians seem to be more confident. Well, that's where we stand at the moment, at least that's how they look to me. This is a complex and volatile crisis. Things can always take unexpected and dramatic turns. We mustn't assume that the news, the trends that we see today will be confirmed tomorrow. But anyway, that's my analysis of the situation today. Thank you for joining me again for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon. In the meantime, remember you can find us on other platforms, Rumble and Locals. If you watch our videos on Rumble, if you go to the top of the video, you can press the red maroon button. That will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can choose to become an active member, and that will enable you to publish your own exclusive content, to read other exclusive content that appears on Locals, and to participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place also exclusively on Locals at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And you can also join us on other platforms, including the new free speech platform SuperU and ODYSEE and others as well. And remember, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also remember to go to our shop. You can find all sorts of great things there: sweatshirts, t-shirts, magic mugs, hats, all sorts of great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. I look forward to you joining me again, and until then, have a very good day.